In the book of Ephesians, Paul is writing to the church in Ephesus, and he warns them. He warns them to put on the armor of God, but what he also says is this famous line, "For your struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers, the authorities, the cosmic powers that rule this dark world." That's not really a perfect translation, but it continues to point to something that we are witnessing in our time. And that is that not that this some of the things that we struggle against, in fact, at the core of what we are in combat with, is not something so simple as man's wrath and wickedness. And yet the Bible begins with the Garden of Eden, where sin entered in through the world into the world through one man. And so we are beset with this not so subtle challenge, recognizing that there is more to the conflict than meets the eye. But what we are oftentimes left with, and what our generation has been left with after years of asking this question, is what are the rules of engagement? What is the way that I fight in this great fight? How do I live in such a way that makes the world a better place? Or if I'm going to be clear in this one, if you're going to tell me that I'm in a war, then how do I fight it? And throughout history, we've seen great awakenings, those oftentimes bookended by periods of violent conflict or scattered throughout. The first one in the American timeline taking place before the American Revolution, with characters such as Jonathan Edwards, and the second one taking place into the 1800s, and we see things like the tent revivals, and we see issues that pertain to even the Civil War in America. You have the kind of old American trope of the traveling preacher, and that has been that's a maybe a legacy that's been stained quite a bit. But mankind is fallible, whereas the Word of God is infallible. At least we have something to put our hope in. But the core of the question and why we talk about these cosmic forces and these ideas is hopefully to clear up some space that has been made muddy. We've talked about recently in the past about how the use of war imagery is very great for ginning up urgency. But if that urgency has no direction upon which to go, then the person who has been motivated by it is oftentimes left with a greater backlash and, let's call it, withdraw than what they started with. And so if we're going to talk about spiritual forces, and we're going to talk about what's going on in this world, and we're going to talk about the references, whether we put it in our art or in our speech or in our language, there is one place that I want to start with, and that is, if we are going to talk about war, we should believe that we are in one. And if we are going to believe that we are in one, we should act like it. And this again harkens back to the Screw Tape Letters, which was written by C.S. Lewis, which warns us that one of the greatest things the devil can do to trick us is to convince us he's not here. And certainly recent events, if not the last 20 years of our lives, have identified that there is very real evil in the world, and sometimes it lives within us, within our own institutions, within our own communities, within our own hearts and worldviews. And it's something that we have to take effort, we have to take painful effort to eradicate it and move it out of our lives. But let's start from the top. Let's start from what it can look like. And this is where we run afoul of various conspiracy theories, and we run afoul of various, let's just say, debilitating belief systems. And that first one goes like this. If someone is going to tell you that you're in a war, but then follow up with the condemnation of all warlike activities, then be careful. You might be dealing with a charlatan of urgency. So, how do we talk about this war? Well, certainly there's a conflict over the hearts of men. People are being swayed into evil, captured by ideologies which turn them into almost mindless beasts. We've seen the outreach of wickedness in the form of bloodshed and violence. We've seen people starve one another for the sake of their own wealth. There is certainly no shortage of evil to be found in the world, but if we misattribute it, what good are we going to be at fighting it? One of the greatest strategies we see in human conflict is if I can convince you that the war is over here while I go and wage a battle over there, if I convince you that I'm moving to your right flank and something comes in from your left flank where you're not protected, then I can take an advantage over you. And so when we think about these things and we think about spiritual war and spiritual conflict, it is important that we do so with the martial vigilance that we expect out of our greatest warfighters, to look deeply into what we believe and what we think about. And one thing that we see in the Old Testament of the Bible is very clear cut cases where the God of Israel comes to their defense against their enemies, both militaristically and otherwise. But then what we run into in the New Testament is something not so clear. Earlier we talked about the Maccabees and how the nation of Israel established some sorts of independence after the rule of Alexander the Great, but that rule was collapsed. That independence was collapsed not by simply a overarching or a superior power marching through, but through slow, steady concessions into that battle. The Hasmonean dynasty and some of what took place between the Old Testament and the New Testament paints a picture of how the people of Israel established independence, but then spoiled their victory quickly with petty corruption and infighting and a collapse from the interior. In fact, there are accounts where differing warring factions within the now free state of Israel had chosen to go to a greater empire, that of Rome, and appeal to the Roman Empire to give them liberation or protect them, or even to, let's just say, solve petty squabbles amongst the leadership. And so for the first thing that we can say is we want to start on the top. We might end up a little bit in the middle, but then the ultimate question that we end up really coming down to is, how then do I as an individual live? The spiritual battle takes place in a realm that we don't have absolute access to. Our eyes do not see that far. Our ears are only able to hear what is shown to us, but our hearts are looking for something greater to give our lives to. This is a phenomenon we're seeing take place in our world today as the end of the new atheist movement comes crashing down, and that, let's say, peaceful harbor of unbelief steadily erodes and collapses under its false foundation. And it isn't so much to say that people who are considering themselves atheist don't have some dog in the fight. Rather, it's that the foundation that worldview was built on did not last as long as people expected it to. Multiculturalism has rushed into its place, but what does multiculturalism and atheism have to do with a spiritual war? And let me tell you, I put this out recently. We've seen people putting on quote unquote, well, not even quote unquote, but like semi theatrical experiences where you could bring your children to a demon summoning operation. And if that isn't a good wake up call, well, we will continue listening and going on. And ultimately, well, not even ultimately, but so as we see what spiritual war has looked at, we have seen things that we have seen different examples of what it looks like. If we were to get into the most abstract and create a horseshoe, at the very far end of the abstraction spectrum, we realize that at the end of the day, it is a battle for the hearts and souls of men. And there is some great cosmic conflict over what we believe and what we think about and what we hold to be right and true and good. And if you break apart that abstract a little bit, I'm sorry, you not de-abstract it. If you seek to ground that abstract concept of a war against good and evil, you must come up with an answer of what is the source of the good, or how do we define it? And we see evidence of this conflict in our lives, but we are then struggling to place exactly where it fits in our worldview. The existence of evil does not require a doctorate in theology to observe, nor does somebody need to have a special operations background to have some modicum of understanding of violence and its application in the world. We've talked about gatekeeping in the past, and one place that we should probably look at where gatekeeping might take place, or something where we would not want it to follow through with, is saying that it can only be done, the conflict in this world is only done by other people. The way that wars are waged in this world are not purely conventional and straightforward. Oftentimes they're subversive. That we use influence methods, and we use what some people might call the fifth generation of warfare. And then there's the economic form of warfare, which we've brought up in the past. But in summary, one can ask the question: if a country employs rogue fighters or non-state actors in another nation to use a mechanism to destroy the economy of another population, is this enough to consider war? Very, very real people lose their lives in America because of things like fentanyl and drugs in our world, but yet we're caught with a difficulty by the layers of abstractions. The layers of abstractions can be, well, you have the people in America, and it's not necessarily a fight against the armed forces or the police, but rather the nation as a whole, and they're under a form of attack through the importation of a drug which causes people to die. And that drug is also freely distributed by non-state actors who are financially incentivized by other people to continue that distribution in the United States. I don't think it would be safe to say that America has a clean slate in this field. We have certainly engaged in shadow wars, and we've engaged in regime change, and we've engaged in even the early eras of the Rangers, which we've talked about in quite a bit because of a book I'm reading through. And what these things start to look like is, well, we know that evil exists outside of nation states, so it's above that in this hierarchy between say God and man, and that war is above, that true conflict exists somewhere above government but below, let's just say, God. Because I would not argue for a dualistic worldview that has something like a good God and an evil God perfectly matched in perpetual conflict with one another. That doesn't follow suit with a Christian worldview. So on the top, on the one end of this conflict, on the high end, we recognize that there is a war of good and evil, and we understand what that good is because we are all people who believe, or we are all people who have some sort of understanding of morality, and the source of that morality for each one of us is God. For those of us who are Christians, that is a very literal statement, and for those of us who claim to be otherwise, then it might be a bit of an abstraction. So below the idea of good versus evil, we have nation states and populations, and below that we have organizations and communities, and below that we have families, and below that we have the individual. Scaling up from man, we have I, myself, a person. Then you go a little bit broader and you have my immediate family, and then my greater family, and then my community. And that community is both local and, in this case, spread across the country and the world. And then you keep going up, you've got communities, and some of those live together and form nation states, and some of them don't. But then you have nation states themselves that can be in conflict with one another, or there can be conflicts within two nation states that are crossing borders to be in conflicts across the world. International war doesn't need to know any boundaries. But then above that, you have the questions of good and evil, right and wrong. And so as we talk about things like just war theory and the difference between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, jus ad bellum and jus in bello, we recognize that in some ways, whether or not we are capable of making a call for a justified war, we are already in one in the conflict of good versus evil. But ultimately, this leaves us with that hard question of then what are the rules of engagement? What are my tools for fighting in this war? What do I do? How do I train? How do I discipline my body and my mind and my soul to be a capable fighter in this arena? One of the worst things that the church can do to people is they could convince them that they're in a spiritual war and then strip them of any of the tools of conflict, of fighting in that conflict, by declaring some sort of strange abstracted universal pacifism. If we are going to recognize that we are in a conflict, and then we are recognizing that we are in that war, and if we're in that war, we must fight about it. We don't get a choice in the matter. But if it were so simple as saying, well, we've created a problem, there's a call to action and a call to war, but there's no method of participation, we're at least identifying the problem. Where is it that we fight, and how do we do it? For all of us, it is certainly within our own lives. It is seeking after that which is good and enacting it within our lives and our families. This is doing what we understand to be good, even if it's only within the confines of our own home. That might be disciplining your body, preparing your family, taking care of your household, living in some form of independence, choosing how you live instead of being dragged along by, well, the what would you call it? The manipulating forces of this time. That returning to that hierarchy, we could go as broad as saying that manipulation takes place on every scale. But if that is the case, then it is our responsibility to sharpen our tools by reading, by praying, by understanding and submitting to that which we understand to be good and living it out. If it were so simple to say that, well, just do what the Bible says, and then you will be a participant in the war, we would not need to have conversations like this. We would not engage with one another. But instead, we live in this world with its infinitely, well, not infinite, because that would be a factually incorrect statement, but it's ever appearingly infinite, but ever truly ever expanding levels of ambiguity in our own lives. For some of us, that means raising your children to be good people, to live how they ought live. There is a right way to live and a wrong way, and we must seek after that. And if the right way is however you feel like it, well, we are setting ourselves up for failure. There's a reason why those who tell you to do what feels good all the time always lead to some sort of death in the end. Hedonism doesn't end in glorious utopia, it ends in the slaughter of millions. Because our never ending quest for utopia is a quest to remake the world in our image, to abandon imago Dei and try to create imago Imperium, a world recreated in our own image. And this cosmic war takes place not only on our own lives, but it takes place throughout the world as people will give themselves over to evil knowingly and willingly so that they can bask in that short masturbatory experience of fake, falsified bliss. We recognize that the rules of engagement apply to us as individuals, whether or not we can see some sort of institution of sorts introducing rules of engagement for us. In fact, this is where we could even get the idea of a rule of engagement, because there is a right way and a wrong way to fight in this world. And if we are truly in a battle of good against evil, and we try to use evil means to accomplish good ends, we will be doing ourselves a disservice, giving the enemy a foothold in our own community. It's a strange thing to say, and I wish I could put it together in a mere 20-minute segment, but it's something that we've recognized take place in this world over and over again. And so the first call of this great conflict of good and evil is, where are you, and will you join us? Will you be a part of this, whether it is as overt as men and women gathering together in a Bible study or in community with one another, or are you going to continue to try to seek it alone? Do not fear, or do not be mistaken, the fear of missing out might become absolute if we continue to remain complacent. And there is good to be seen in the world. There are good people doing this, and it is a good thing to see that we are not alone. But the first step is recognizing first and foremost that you are going to engage, that you are here, and that you are not alone in this conflict. The second layer of looking out after your family. So we've talked about raising children or building up your community around you. And this means the very overt intentional participation in something that draws you together towards the good. It is not that we cannot do good in this world. That is the lie. What is more important is that we willingly participate in it. And that good might be looking out for one another through resources, or understanding that as we extend towards a decentralized world, the line between the clouds, the moon, that haunted moon up there, subtle plug, that haunted moon up there, the distance between that haunted space above and our very real lives continues to close. We do not want to find ourselves on the battlefield for our faith and our life, realizing that day that that is where we are at. They say things that are, and not quite, it's sort of an analogy in the military. You never want to do anything for the first time in combat, but sometimes that's what happens. You don't get to always choose every battle you're in, but rather the urgency of the greater conflict is coming back down to us. And as we are looking at these questions, we must ask ourselves, what are the rules of engagement? What are my tools? One of them is living blamelessly. That means disciplining yourself to do what is right and disdain what is wrong, to push it away. You can't simply hate what is evil, you have to love what is good. Another one is another one is the shield of faith, and that is to consider deeply what it is you believe in. Where do you believe the source of right and wrong to come from? We are starting in the soul, in our minds, in our lives. And if we act on those things, then we strengthen ourselves, we bolster our position. Another one is the sword of the Spirit. I am again quoting from, or pulling straight from Ephesians. And the Spirit can sometimes look like the will to continue on, but it oftentimes is something that we recognize as something that we are wholly dependent on, as the very will to live can quickly evaporate before our eyes with no explanation or argumentation. Of course, we have the belt of truth. Where do you get your truth? Where do you understand it? It's not your truth, it's the truth. But I am probably preaching to the choir when I say that. We have to understand that we know and we are in pursuit of that which is true. And the last one might be the gospel, or the gospel of peace. We want to bring about peace. An endless war and a challenge to this idea of Musashi Moyomoto's warrior. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. Is that the warrior's intent, if not to establish a world with gardens and do so rightly, is a warrior who wants war for war's sake. And he is no different than that gardener in a war, because that warrior in a time of peace will have to struggle with his conflict of his daily life. Not everything can be solved with the sword, but we still have to be capable of wielding it. And so there should be an encouragement. Go train, become capable, seek after community, build your time together, spend time, effort, energy, sacrificing that which you know to be detrimental to your life, and pursue that which is right and good and true. The problem that I wanted to start with, and is still the hard one to answer, is what are the rules of engagement? And on the one hand, for the battle of your soul, there are none, because the battle of your soul is trying to establish your place in that rule. Well, not rule as like an emperor or anything, but rules, in those things that we are called to live by. If it were so easy, why wouldn't have men been doing it for thousands of years? But they've been trying, and we are part of that struggle. So This episode was born out of an encouragement of seeing across the field that we are coming to the end of the age of neutrality, where you can pick nothing as your worldview. And so if you find yourself in the depths of despair, the answer is to call out. Fellow men can point you in the right direction, but they cannot provide the salvation you need. That only comes from the Lord. It only comes from Christ. So carry on. But do not be mistaken. There is a conflict over our lives, and when we ignore it, we are made fools by that ignorance. Ignorance is something that needs to be maintained. So what forms of ignorance are you maintaining? Are you keeping up with? Let them go, replace them with diligence, seek what is good, become strong. No one is gatekeeping you from reading that Bible, and no one is gatekeeping you from training and going out and learning with other people. It is difficult. There will be challenges, but we will go forth, we will conquer, and we will carry on because we believe that in the end, the good wins. The very idea that this again harkens back to that very idea that we've built into this idea of the moon's haunted, is that there is this cosmic struggle. There is surveillance and there is evil working in our worlds. But what we are recognizing is that gap between the ever distant empire and our own lives is getting narrower. And as it is getting closer to home, and as it is getting closer to our own very lives, it is our responsibility to seek after what are the justified actions in war. If you are being if you're being misled by multiculturalism, the answer is not to go immediately swing to the level of jihad, but recognize where that ending begins and reel it back, dial it into something, a reasonable action that you can participate in. But I encourage you, go forth and do these things because you are not alone. And we are here recording one last time or another time in this garage as we are making another move to bring those things to your attention and to tell you, if nothing else, that nagging pain you feel that something is going on there is not wrong. But there are many out there who seek to misguide you, lead you astray, and harness that vigor for pursuing what is right and turn it into an act for evil. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We are 1 year into episodes. We have got well over 150,000 downloads. We've been carrying on for a year, and we thank you for your support. We've been carrying on as best as we can, despite how difficult the economy's been through moves and family changes and challenges and tragedies. But we are here, thankful to be a part of this community. If you want to support us, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, or you can head over to Redacted LLC and grab your limited edition of the Moon's Haunted Tea, because we're going to do a pre-order and then we're going to wrap it up quick and get those to the print shop as soon as possible. With that being the case, we close off, go forth and conquer.